Section 15, Ingersoll's lecture on the review of his reviewers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ingersoll's lecture on the review of his reviewers, from the book Lectures of Colonel Robert Greene Ingersoll, Volume 2. Ladies and gentlemen, what have I said? What has been my offense? I have been spoken of as if I were a wolf endeavoring to devour the entire fold of sheep in the absence of the shepherd. I believe in the trinity of observation, reason, and science, the trinity of man, woman, and child, the trinity of love, joy, and hope, and thought that every man has a right to think for himself, and no other man has the right to debar him of this privilege by torture, by social ostracism, or any of the numerous other expedients resorted to by the enemies of advancement. I ask, does God wish the lip worship of a slave, a sneak, of the man that dares not reason? If I were the infinite God, I would rather have the worship of one good man of brains than a world of such men. I am told that I am in danger of everlasting fire, and that I shall burn forever in hell. I tell you, my friends, if I were going to hell tonight, I would take an overcoat with me. Do not tell me that the eternal future of a man may depend upon his belief. I deny it. That a man should be punished for having come to an honest conclusion, the honest production of his brain, that an honest conclusion should be deemed a crime, and so declared, it is an infamous, monstrous assertion, and I would rather go to hell than to keep the company of a God who would damn his child for an honest belief. Next, I preached that a woman was the equal of man, entitled to everything that he is entitled to be his partner, and to be cherished and respected because she is the weaker, to be treated as a splendid flower. I said that man should not be cross to her, but fill the house that she is in with such joy that it would burst out at the window. I have said that matrimony is the holiest of sacraments, and I have said that the Bible took woman up thousands of years ago and handed her down to man as a slave. And I have said that the Bible is a barbarous book for teaching that she is a slave, and I repeat it, and will prove later what I have said. I have pleaded for the right of man, of wife, and of the little child. I have said we can govern children by love and affection. I have asked for tender treatment for the child of crime. I have asked mothers to cease beating their children and take them to their hearts. And for this I am denounced by the religious press and men in the pulpits as a demon and a monster of heresy, who should be driven out from among you as an unclean thing. But I should not complain. Only a few years ago I should have been compelled to look at my denouncers through flame and smoke, but they dare not treat me so now, or they would. 100 years ago I should have been burned for claiming the right of reason. 50 years ago I should have been imprisoned, and my wife and children would have been torn away from me. And 25 years ago I could not have made a living in the United States in my profession, the law. But I live now and can see through it all, and all is light. I delivered another lecture on ghosts, in which I sought to show that man had been controlled in the past by phantoms created by his own imagination, in which the pencil of fear had drawn pictures for him on the canvas of superstition, and that men had groveled in the dirt before their own superstitious creations. I endeavored to show that man had received nothing from these ghosts but hatred, blood, ignorance, and unhappiness, and that they had filled our world with woe and tears. This is what I endeavored to show, no more. Now everyone has as much right to differ with me as I with them, but it does not make the slightest difference for the purpose of argument whether I am a good man or a bad, whether I am ugly or handsome, although I would not object to resting my case on that issue. The only thing to be considered and discussed is what I have said true, or is it untrue? Now I said that the Bible came from the ghosts, and that they gave us the doctrine of immortality of the soul, which I deny. Now the immortality of the soul, if there is such a thing, is a fact, and therefore no book could make it. If I am immortal, I am. If not, no book can make me so. The doctrine of immortality is based in the hope of the human heart, and is not derived from any book or creed. It has its origin in the ebb and flow of the human affections, and will continue as long as affection, and is the rainbow in the sky of hope. It does not depend on a book, on ghosts, superstition of any kind. It is a flower of the human heart. I did say that these ghosts or the book taught that human slavery was right, that most monstrous of all crimes, that makes miserable the victim and debases the master, for a slave can have all the virtues while the master cannot. I did say that it riveted the chains upon the oppressed, and that it counseled the robbing of that most precious of all boons, liberty. I add that the book upheld all this, that it sustained and sanctified the institution of human slavery. I did also assert that this same book, which my critics claim was inspired by God, inculcated the doctrine of witchcraft, for which people, through its teaching, were hanged and burned for bringing disease upon the regal persons of kings, and for souring beer. I did say that this book upheld that most of all infamies, polygamy, and that it did not teach political liberty or religious toleration, but political slavery and the most wretched intolerance. I did try to prove that these ghosts knew less than nothing about medicine, politics, legislation, astronomy, geology, and astrology, but I am also aware that in saving these things I have done what my censors think I ought not to have done. But the victor ought not to feel malice, and I shall have none. As soon as I had said all these things, some gentlemen felt called upon to answer them, which they had a right to do. Now, I like fairness, am enamored with it, probably because I get so little of it. I can say a great many mean things, for I have read all the religious papers, and I ought to be able to account for every motive in a mean manner after. The first gentleman whom I shall call your attention to is the Reverend Dr. Woodbridge. It seems that when I delivered my lectures, the conclusion had come to, that man does not believe in anything but matter and force. That man does not believe in spirit. Why not? If by spirit you mean that which thinks, I am one of them myself. If you mean by spirit that which hopes and reasons and loves and aspires, why then I am a believer in spirits. But whatever spirit there is in this universe, I will take my oath is a natural product, and not superimposed upon this world. All I will say is that whatever is natural, and there is as much goodness in my judgment, as much spirit here in this world as in any other, and you are just as near the heart of the universe here as you ever can be. But they say there is matter and force, and there is force and there is spirit. Well, what of it? There is no matter without force. What would keep it together unless there was force? Can you imagine matter without force? Honor bright, can you conceive a force without matter? And what is spirit? They say spirit is the first thing that ever was. It seems to me sometimes as though spirit was the blossom and fruit of all, and not the commencement. But they say spirit was first. What would that spirit do? No force, no matter, a spirit living in an infinite vacuum without side, edge, or bottom. This spirit created the world. And if this spirit did, there must have been a time when it commenced to create, and back of that an eternity spent in absolute idleness. Can a spirit exist without matter or without force? I honestly say I do not know what matter is, what force is, what spirit is. But if you mean by matter anything that I can touch, or by force anything that we can overcome, then I believe in them. If you mean by spirit anything that can think and love, I believe in spirits. The next critic who assailed me was the Reverend Mr. Kalloch. I am not going to show you what I can withstand. I am not going to say a word about the reputation of this man, although he took some liberties with mine. This gentleman says negation is a poor thing to die by. I would just as lief die by that as the opposite. He spoke of the last hours of Paine and Voltaire, and the terrors of their deathbeds. But the question arises, is there a word of truth in all he said? I have observed that the murderer dies with courage and firmness in many instances, but that does not make me think that it sanctified his crime. In fact, it makes no impression upon me one way or the other. When a man through old age or infirmity approaches death, the intellectual faculties are dimmed, his senses become less and less, and as he loses these, he goes back to his old superstition. Old age brings back the memories of childhood, and the great bard gave in the corrupt and besotted Falstaff, who prattled of babbling brooks and green fields, an instance of the retracing steps taken by the memory at the last gasp. It has been said that the Bible was sanctified by our mothers. Every superstition in the world from the beginning of all time has had such a sanctification. The Turk dying on the Russian battlefield, pressing the Koran to his bosom, breathes his last thinking of the loving adjuration of his mother to guard it. Every superstition has been rendered sacred by the love of a mother. I know what it has cost the noble and the brave to throw to the winds these superstitions. Since the death of Voltaire, who was innocent of all else than a desire to shake off the superstitions of the past, the curse of Rome has pursued him, and ignorant Protestants have echoed that curse. I like Voltaire. Whenever I think of him, it is as a plumed knight coming from the fray with victory shining upon his brow. He was once in the Bastille, and while there he changed his name from Francis Marie Aloysius to Voltaire, and when the Bastille was torn down, Voltaire was the battle cry of those who did it. He did more to bring about religious toleration than any man in the galaxy of those who strove for the privilege of free thought. He was always on the side of justice. He was full of faults and had many virtues. His doctrines have never brought unhappiness to any country. He died as serenely as anyone could. Speaking to his servant, he said, "Farewell, my faithful friend." Could he have done a more noble act than to recognize him who had served him faithfully as a man? What more could be wished? And now let me say here, I will give $1,000 in gold to any clergyman who can substantiate that the death of Voltaire was not as peaceful as the dawn. And of Thomas Paine, whom they assert died in fear and agony, frightened by the clanking chains of devils, in fact, frightened to death by God. I will give $1,000 likewise to anyone who can substantiate this absurd story, a story without a word of truth in it. And let me ask, who dies in the most fear? The man who, like the saint, exclaims, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Or Voltaire, who peacefully and quietly bade his servant farewell? The question is not who died right, but who lived right. I look upon death as the most unimportant moment of life, and believe that not half the responsibility is attached to dying that is to living properly. This Reverend Mr. Kalloch is a Baptist. He has a right to be a Baptist. The first Baptist, though, was a heretic. But it is among the wonders that when a heretic gets 15 or 20 to join him, he suddenly begins to be orthodox. Roger Williams was a Baptist, but how he or anyone not destitute of good sense could be one passes my comprehension. Let me illustrate. Suppose it was the day of judgment tonight, and we were all assembled, as the ghosts say we will be judged, and God should ask a man, "Have you been a good man?" Yes. "Have you loved your wife and children?" Yes. "Have you taken good care of them and made them happy?" Yes. "Have you tried to do right by your neighbors?" Yes. "Paid all your debts?" Yes. And then cap the climax by asking, "Were you ever baptized?" Could a solitary being hear that question without laughing? I think not. I once happened to be in the company of 6 or 7 Baptist elders. I never have been able to understand since how I got into such bad company, and they wanted to know what I thought of baptism. I answered that I had not given the matter any attention. In fact, I had no special opinion on the subject. But they pressed me, and finally I told them that I thought, with soap, baptism was a good thing. The Reverend Mr. Guard has attacked me, and has described me, among other things, as a dog barking at a train. Of course, he was the train. He said, first, the Bible is not an immoral book, because I swore upon it when I joined the Free and Accepted Masons. That settles the question. Secondly, he says that Solomon had softening of the brain and fatty degeneration of the heart. Thirdly, that the Hebrews had the right to slay all the inhabitants of Canaan according to the doctrine of the survival of the fittest. He says that the destruction of these Canaanites, the ripping open by the bloody sword of women with child, was an act of sublime mercy. Think of that! He says that the Canaanites should have been driven from their homes, and not only driven, but that the men who simply were guilty of the crime of fighting for their native land, the old men with gray hairs, the old mothers, the young mothers, the little dimpled prattling child, that it was an act of sublime mercy to plunge the sword of religious persecution into old and young. If that is mercy, Let us have injustice. If there is that kind of a God, I am sorry that I exist. Fourthly, Mr. Guard said God has the right to do as he pleases with the beings he has created. And fifthly, that God, by choosing the Jews and governing them personally, spoiled them to that degree that they crucified him the first opportunity they had. That shows what a good administration will do. Sixthly, he says polygamy is not a bad thing when compared with a picture of Anthony and Cleopatra, now on exhibition in this city. I will just say one word about art. I think this is one of the most beautiful words in our language, and do you know, it never seemed to me necessary for art to go into partnership with a rag. I like the paintings of Angelo, of Raphael. I liked those splendid souls that are put upon canvas, all there is of human beauty. There are brave souls in every land who worship nature grand and nude, and who with swift, indignant hand tear off the fig leaves of the prude. Seventhly, it may be said that the Bible sanctions slavery, but that it is not an immoral book if it does. Mr. Guard playfully says that he is a puppy 9 days old, that he was only 8 days old when I came here. I'm inclined to think he has overstated his age. I account for his argument precisely as he did for the sin of Solomon, softening of the brain, or fatty degeneration of the heart. It does seem to me that if I were a good Christian, and knew that another man was going down to the bottomless pit to be miserable and in agony forever, I would try to stop him, and instead of filling my mouth with epithet and invective, and drawing the lips of malice back from the teeth of hatred, my eyes would be filled with tears, and I would do what I could to reclaim him and take him up in the arms of my affection. The next gentleman is the Reverend Mr. Robinson, who delivered a sermon entitled Ghost Against God, or Ingersoll Against Honesty. Of course, he was honest. He apologized for attending an infidel lecture upon the ground that he hated to contribute to the support of a materialistic showman. I am willing to trade faggots for epithets, and the rack for anything that may be said in his sermon. I am willing to trade the instrument of torture with which they could pull the nails from my fingers for anything which the ingenuity of orthodoxy can invent. When I saw that report, although I do not know that I ought to tell it, I felt bad. I knew that man's conscience must be rankling like a snake in his bosom, that he had contributed $1 to the support of a man as bad as I. I wrote him a letter in which I said, "The Reverend Samuel Robinson, my dear sir, in order to relieve your conscience of the stigma of having contributed to the support of an unbeliever in ghosts, I hereby enclose the $1 you paid to attend my lecture." I then gave him a little good advice to be charitable, and regretted exceedingly that any man could listen to me for an hour and a half and not go away satisfied that other men had the same right to think that he had. The speaker went on to answer the argument of Mr. Robinson with regard to persecution, contending that Protestants had been guilty of it no less than Catholics, and showing that the first people to pass an act of toleration in the New World were the Catholics in Maryland. The reverend gentleman has stated also that infidelity has done nothing for the world in the development of art and science. Has he ever heard of Darwin, of Tyndall, of Huxley, of John W. Draper, of Auguste Comte, of Descartes, Laplace, Spinoza, or any man who has taken a step in advance of his time? Orthodoxy never advances. When it does advance, it ceases to be orthodoxy. A reply to certain strictures in the Occident led the lecturer up to another ministerial critic, namely, the Reverend W. E. Igems. I want to say that so far as I can see in his argument, this gentleman has treated me in a kind and considerate spirit. He makes 2 or 3 mistakes, but I suppose they are the fault of the report from which he quoted. I am made to say in his sermon that there is no sacred place in the universe. What I did say was, there is no sacred place in all the universe of thought. There is nothing too holy to be investigated, nothing too sacred to be understood. And I said that the fields of thought were fenceless, that they should be without a wall. I say so tonight. He further said that I said that a man had not only the right to do right, but to do wrong. What I did say was, liberty is the right to do right, and the right to think right, and the right to think wrong, not the right to do wrong. That is all I have to say in regard to that gentleman, except that so far as I could see, he was perfectly fair, and treated me as though I was a human being as well as he. The speaker sarcastically referred to the slurs thrown upon him by his reviewers, who have claimed that his theories have no foundation, his arguments no reason, and that his utterances are vapid, blasphemous, and unworthy a reply. He said that their statements and their actions were sadly at variance, for, while declaring him a senseless idiot, they spent hours in striving to prove themselves not idiots. In other words, in one breath they declare that his views were absolutely without point and needed no explaining away, while in direct rebuttal of this declaration they devoted time and labor in attempts to disprove the very things they called self-evident absurdities. Turning from this subject, Mr. Ingersoll read numerous extracts from the Bible, with interpolated comments. He claimed that the Bible authorized slavery, and that many devoted believers in that book had turned the cross of Christ into a whipping post. He did not wish it understood that he could find no good in believers in creeds. Far from it, for some of his dearest friends were most orthodox in their religious ideas, and there had been hundreds of thousands of good men among both clergy and laymen. History has shown no people more nobly self-sacrificing than the Jesuit fathers who first visited this country to proselytize among the Indians. But these men and their like were better than their creeds, better than the book in which their faith was centered. The Bible tells us distinctly that the world was made in 6 days, not periods, but actual bona fide days, a statement which it iterates and reiterates. It also tells us that God lengthened the day for the benefit of a gentleman named Joshua, in other words, that he stopped the rotary motion of the earth. Motion is changed into heat by stoppage, and the world turns with such velocity that its sudden stoppage would create a heat of intensity beyond the wildest flight of our imagination, and yet this impossible feat was performed that Joshua might have longer time to expend in slaying a handful of Amorites. The Bible also upholds the doctrines of witchcraft and spiritualism, for Saul visited the witch of Endor, and she, after preparing the cabinet, trotted out the spirit of Samuel, said spirit kindly joining in conversation with Saul without requiring the aid of a trance medium. The speaker then quoted at length from Leviticus concerning wizards and evil spirits, described the temptation of Christ by Satan, and the driving of devils from man into swine. He sneered at the rights of children as biblically described, citing the law which sentenced them to be stoned to death for disobedience to parents, the almost sacrifice of Isaac by his father, and the actual murder of Jephthah's daughter, asking if a God who could demand such worship was worthy the love of man. He next referred to the conversation between God and Satan concerning the man Job, and of the reward given to the latter for his long continued patience. His 3 daughters and his 7 sons had been taken from him merely to test his patience, and the merciful God gave him in exchange 3 other daughters and 7 sons, but they were not the children whom he had loved and lost. The Bible represents woman as vastly inferior to man, while he believed, with Robbie Burns, that God made man with a prentice hand, and woman after he had learned the trade. Polygamy also was a doctrine supported by this pure and pious work, a doctrine so foul that language is not strong enough to express its infamy. The Bible taught, as a religious creed, that if your wife, your sister, your brother, your dearest friend tempted you to change from the religion of your fathers, your duty to God demanded that you should at once strike a blow at the life of your tempter. Let us suppose, then, that in truth God went to Palestine and selected the scanty tribes of Israel as his chosen people, and supposing that he afterward came to Jerusalem in the shape of a man and taught a different doctrine from the one prescribed by their book and their clergy, and that the chosen people, in obedience to the education he had prepared for them, struck at the life of him who tempted them. Were they to be cursed by God and man because the former had reaped the harvest of his own sowing? End of section 15. This is a LibriVox recording read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina on June 18th, 2009.